While the world was sleeping, nothing in the universe was in a hurry. The stars held their places. Galaxies turned slowly. Light had been traveling for millions of years and had no need to rush. Darkness, too. Darkness knew how to wait. There was a planet, a blue and green planet. It was turning as well, but without haste. The rotation was like a dance, a slow dance, a repeated dance. On one side of the planet, night had arrived. Darkness stretched like a soft blanket across the land. Cities were sleeping. Houses were silent. People were breathing, simply breathing. In the forests, trees were sending roots deeper into the earth. Leaves swayed gently. There was no wind, only air. The air was breathing too. In the mountains, there was snow. Snow never spoke. It simply existed, white and soft. It had been there for centuries. It would remain for centuries more. It was not in a hurry. In the oceans, waves were rolling, 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 rolling. Each wave like the one before. Each wave like the one to follow. None were special. All were the same moment. On the shores, sand was waiting. Millions of grains of sand, each in its own place. None were moving. Only when the moon came would they shift slightly. Then they would be still again. In space, a satellite was orbiting the planet. Slowly, in the same path. Always the same path. For billions of years it had been this way. For billions more it would continue. The satellite was glowing, reflecting the sun's light, but the sun was not visible from this side now. The night side was dark. Only stars remained, very distant stars. The stars were twinkling, but if you looked closely, perhaps they were not twinkling at all. Perhaps they were simply burning, slowly burning. They had been burning for billions of years. They must have been tired, but their time to rest had not yet come. On the planet, there was a plain, a flat plain. It stretched for kilometers. Grass had grown upon it. The grass was yellow. If there had been wind, it would have swayed, but there was no wind. It simply stood. Among the grass, small flowers grew, purple flowers. They had closed for the night. When the sun rose, they would open, but sunrise was still hours away. The flowers were waiting. They knew how to wait. On the plain stood a tree, a solitary tree. Its trunk was thick. Its branches were long. It had dropped its leaves. It was preparing for winter. Winter had not yet arrived, but it would come. The tree knew. Trees always knew. Beneath the tree, a wolf was sleeping. It had curled into itself. Its tail rested against its nose. It was breathing. Its chest rose and fell slowly. It was not dreaming, only sleeping. In the distance, there were hills, low hills. Shrubs grew upon them. The shrubs were sleeping too. Everything was sleeping. Beyond the hills, a river was flowing, flowing slowly. Its water appeared still, but it was flowing. It was always flowing. Rivers never stopped, but they never hurried either. Along the riverbank, there were stones, round stones. Water had made them round. It had taken centuries. The stones lay in silence. In their memory was the sound of water. But now there was silence. Everything was silent. A frog sat among the stones. It was not moving. Its eyes were half closed. It was not thinking. It simply existed. Nothing more was needed. In the water, fish were swimming, swimming slowly. Their fins moved gently. They moved with the current. They did not resist. There was no point in resisting. The river passed beneath a bridge, a stone bridge, an old bridge. Who had built it was unknown. When it had been built was unknown. No one used it anymore. It simply stood. Bridges knew how to stand. stretched like long lines. They were not moving. When there was no wind, clouds stood still. They simply waited. A star fell, but no one saw it. It did not need to be seen. The star simply continued on its path, burning as it went. Then it vanished. Another star appeared, then another, then silence. In space, there was a gas cloud, an enormous cloud. Inside it, stars were being born, very slowly being born. The birth of a star took millions of years, but the cloud was not in a hurry. It had time, infinite time. In another galaxy, there was another planet. It was also turning. It was also blue, but no one lived there. No one had ever lived there. No one ever would. There were only oceans. The oceans rolled with waves. There were no shores. Everywhere was ocean. Waves crashed into one another, then rolled again. That planet had no satellite. It was alone, but it did not feel lonely. It had no need to feel. It simply turned. On the first planet, the blue and green planet, there was a forest, a dense forest. The trees stood very close together. Their trunks were thick. Their leaves were dark. At night, they were darker still. Inside the forest, there was light, a small light. It came from insects, green lights. They flew and flickered, slowly. There was rhythm. Each insect glowed with the same rhythm. In the forest, it was like a symphony, a silent symphony. A path ran between the trees, a narrow path, a dirt path. There were tracks on the path, old tracks. Rain had erased them, but they could still be felt. At the edge of the path, mushrooms had grown, small mushrooms. They had red caps. White spots dotted their surface. They glowed faintly. Perhaps they were not really glowing. Perhaps they only appeared that way in the darkness. At the base of a tree trunk, there was moss, soft moss, green moss, damp moss. If a finger touched it, it would sink in. But no one was touching it. The moss simply existed. It was growing, perhaps a millimeter per year. It was not in a hurry. Deep in the forest, there was a lake, a small lake, a round lake. Its water was black, but it was actually clear. Only darkness was reflected in the water. The sky was reflected. Stars were reflected. In the middle of the lake, there was an island, a tiny island. On it stood a tree. At the top of the tree, there was a bird's nest. In the nest, a bird was sleeping. It had tucked its head beneath its wing. It was breathing. It was dreaming, a dream of flying. Every bird dreamed of flying. At the lake's edge, a deer was drinking water. Drinking slowly, it lifted its head and listened to the surroundings. Then it bent down again. There was no danger. There was never any danger. But deer were always alert. It was instinct. It was habit. Beside the deer stood its fawn. It was still young. It stood next to its mother. It did not move. It simply waited. Young deer learned to wait. In the sky, the moon was rising, rising slowly. It was not quite full. It was slightly incomplete. Perhaps in 3 days it would be full. But the moon was not in a hurry. It had no need to hurry toward fullness. Moonlight struck the forest. It filtered through the trees. It reached the ground. A silver light, a cold light, but a sweet light. Shadows were long, the shadows of trees, the shadows of stones. Everything had a shadow. The shadows were not moving. They simply stretched. In space, the moon continued orbiting the planet. Its surface was covered with craters, ancient craters, billions of years old. Stones had fallen there. Then there had been silence. Now there was only silence. The moon's dark side never saw light. It was always dark, but the darkness was not sad. It was accustomed. Being dark was not a bad thing. It was simply different. On the planet, there was a desert, a wide desert. The sand was golden. At night, the desert grew cold. During the day, it would be hot, but at night, it was cold. On the sand, there were tracks, snake tracks, lizard tracks. Wind had erased some of them, some remained. They would remain until morning. Then the sun would rise. Then it would be hot again. In the distance, there were sand dunes, high dunes. They drew straight lines against the sky, silhouettes against the stars. They did not appear to be moving, but they were moving, very slowly. When wind came, they would move. Now there was no wind, but it would come. At the base of a sand dune, there was a cactus, a spiny cactus. It stood alone. It had no need for water. It could go months without water, years. It stored water inside itself. It was a wise plant, a patient plant. On the cactus, there was a scorpion. It stood motionless, waiting for prey. But if prey did not come, it did not matter. Tomorrow, it would wait. If it did not come tomorrow, it would wait the day after. Scorpions knew how to wait. In the middle of the desert, there was an oasis, a small oasis. There was water there. There were palm trees. Beneath the trees, there was shade. In the shade, there was coolness. At the water's edge, a camel was sleeping. It had folded itself onto its knees. Its eyes were closed. Even while sleeping, it was chewing. A rhythmic motion. Habit. Camels always chewed. At the oasis shore, there were reeds. Thin reeds, tall reeds. They swayed slowly. Perhaps there was wind, a very light wind, an imperceptible wind, but the reeds perceived it. In the water, there were small fish, silver fish. They sparkled in the moonlight. They were swimming, drawing circles. Then they stopped. Then they swam again. In the sky, the Milky Way stretched, a hazy band. It was made of billions of stars, but the stars could not be seen individually. There was only light, a soft light, a milky light. A star died, far away, very far away. There was an explosion, but no sound came. There was no sound in space. There was only light. Light spread. In waves, it spread. Millions of years from now, it would reach somewhere. Perhaps no one would see it. Perhaps someone would. It did not matter. Another star was being born inside a gas cloud, slowly taking shape. Gases were drawing together. There was gravity. There was rotation. Heat was increasing. One day it would burn, but that day had not yet arrived. It would wait. Stars knew how to wait. A planet completed its orbit, a full circle. Around its star, a full circle. A year had passed. On that planet, a year had passed. But on other planets, years passed in different durations. Time was relative. It flowed differently for every place. But nowhere was it in a hurry. The blue planet continued to turn. The night side was slowly rotating. The sun side was approaching, but it had not arrived yet. There were hours. A few more hours of night remained. On a mountain, snow was falling silently. The flakes were small. They fell slowly. When there was no wind, snow fell straight down. It reached the ground and settled there. Layer upon layer, it thickened. Snow drifts were accumulating. White blankets, soft blankets. They covered everything. They covered stones. They covered shrubs. They covered sounds. When snow came, everything became quieter. Beneath a rocky outcrop, a bear was sleeping. It was in winter sleep. It had been sleeping for months. It would sleep for months more. It was breathing very slowly, a few breaths per minute. Its heart beat slowly. Its body had cooled, but it had not died. It was only sleeping, deeply sleeping. Beside the bear were its cubs, 2 cubs. They were also sleeping. They had nestled against their mother, taking warmth. They were dreaming, dreams of spring, dreams of honey, dreams of sun. At the mountain's peak there was an eagle. It was in its nest. Among the rocks, it had built a nest. It had made the nest from branches. It had lined it with feathers. Now it sat there. Its eyes were open. It gazed into the darkness. It was not hunting. It did not hunt at night. It simply waited, waiting for morning. On the mountainside, an avalanche had fallen. It had fallen silently. No one had heard it. Snow had slid downward. It had stopped. Now it had taken a new form. Everything had settled into place. Silence again. On the plain, wind had risen, a gentle wind. It swayed the grass. There was whispering, the whisper of grass. Blades rubbed against one another. A sweet sound emerged, a repeating sound. The wolf woke. It lifted its head. It listened. It heard the wind. It heard nothing else. It laid its head down again. It closed its eyes. It slept again. The tree's branches swayed. The leaves had already fallen. There were only bare branches. The branches creaked faintly. Old trees creaked. Young trees were flexible. But as they aged, they hardened. When they hardened, they made sounds. The wind crossed the plain. It reached the hills. It passed over the hills. It arrived at the river. It passed over the water. The water rippled slightly. Then it smoothed again. The river continued flowing. The wind entered the forest. It wandered among the trees. It rustled leaves. It swayed branches. The insects stopped. They waited until the wind passed. Then they began flickering again. The wind reached the lake. Ripples formed on the lake's surface. The reflection of stars wavered, blurred. Then the wind passed. The surface smoothed again. The stars became clear again. The island stood. The tree stood. The bird slept. Everything slept. The wind crossed the desert. It lifted sand. Just a little. It changed shapes. It changed the edges of the dunes. Tomorrow morning, if you looked, it would appear different. But actually, it was the same. Deserts always appeared to change. But actually, they were always the same. In space, a comet was moving forward. It was made of ice and dust. As it approached the sun, it began to melt. It left a tail behind, a long tail, a bright tail, millions of kilometers long. No one was seeing the comet. It was not yet close. Months from now, it would approach. Then it would be visible. People would look to the sky. They would marvel. Then they would forget. The comet would move away. It would return again in centuries. In the asteroid belt, rocks were orbiting. Thousands of rocks, tens of thousands of rocks. They orbited in their paths. They did not collide with one another. Space was vast, very vast. Collision was rare. Most of the time, everything simply orbited. On one asteroid, there was a crater, a deep crater. Inside it was dark, light never entered. It had been dark for billions of years. No one knew of that crater. There was no need to know. It simply existed. On the planet, there was a city, a large city. Buildings rose high. Lights were on, but few were on. Night had grown late. Most lights had gone out. In the streets, there was no one, no cars. There was silence. Cities were different at night. During the day, they were loud. At night, they were quiet. In one building, a window was lit. Inside, someone was awake, sitting at a desk, thinking, looking outside, looking at the sky, searching for stars. But in the city, stars could not be seen. There were too many lights. Stars disappeared. In another building, everyone was sleeping. Apartments were dark. People were in their beds. They were breathing. They were dreaming. Some were not dreaming, only sleeping. A child was sleeping, an arm tucked beneath the pillow, mouth slightly open, looking peaceful. When morning came, this night would not be remembered. No night was truly remembered. Only certain moments were remembered. The rest was forgotten. An old man was sleeping, lying on his back. His hands were folded on his chest. He was breathing regularly. He had lived a long life. He had seen much, but now it was all distant. There was only sleep, deep sleep. A cat sat in a window, looking outside. Its eyes glowed in the darkness. It seemed to be waiting, but it was not waiting for anything. It was simply sitting. Cats did that. They would sit motionless for hours. In a park, there were trees, rows of trees. Their leaves had fallen. They stood bare. Their branches reached toward the sky. They formed an intricate web. On a bench, a bag sat. Inside were breadcrumbs. They had been left for birds. In the morning, birds would come. They would eat. Now, because it was night, they did not come. Birds slept at night. In the center of the park, there was a fountain, a shallow fountain. Its water was still. On the surface, leaves floated. Sunken leaves. Leaves settled on the bottom. The water was cold. No one touched it. At the fountain's edge, a frog sat. It sat like a stone, not moving. It was unclear if it was even breathing, but it was, breathing very slowly. Frogs slowed in the cold. In warmth, they quickened. Outside the park, there was a road, an empty road, an asphalt road. It gleamed faintly. It must have been damp. Perhaps it had rained. Perhaps dew had fallen. The surface was wet. At the roadside, there was a lamppost. It gave light, yellow light. Beneath it, there was a halo. In the light, small insects flew. Circular patterns. They did not seem to tire. They simply flew. Beyond the road, houses stood in a row, each house identical. Windows dark, doors closed, gardens sleeping, grass uncut, flowers closed, everything waiting for morning. In one house, a clock was ticking. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The sound filled the room, steady, unchanging. Time was passing, second by second, minute by minute, but there was no hurry. Far from the city, in an open field, a telescope pointed toward the sky. No one was using it. It stood alone. Its lens reflected starlight. Inside the lens, the universe was captured, upside down but clear. If someone had looked through it, they would have seen Saturn. Its rings spread wide, ice and rock circling, silent circles, eternal circles. The rings were ancient. They would remain long after everything else had gone. They would have seen Jupiter, its great red spot, a storm larger than the entire Earth, raging for centuries, perhaps for millennia. But from here, it appeared still, frozen in time, beautiful and terrible at once. They would have seen Mars, red and barren, no sound there, no wind there now. Once there had been water, rivers had flowed, lakes had formed, but that was long ago. Now there was only dust, red dust covering everything. They would have seen the moon, every crater visible, every mountain, every valley. The moon kept no secrets. Its face was open, marked by time, scarred by impacts, but still beautiful, still constant. But no one was looking. The telescope stood empty. The universe displayed itself to no one. But the universe did not mind. It had been doing this for billions of years. It would continue for billions more. Audience or not. In a meadow, fireflies were glowing, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands. They blinked in unison, on and off, on and off. A silent conversation, a language of light. Scientists had studied this. They had written papers. They had tried to understand. Synchronization, they called it. Emergent behavior. Complex systems. But naming it did not explain it. Not really. Not the wonder of it. The fireflies did not know they were being studied. They did not know they were creating patterns. They simply existed. They simply glowed. That was enough. Beneath them, the grass was still. Crickets were chirping, a rhythmic sound, ancient and familiar, the sound of summer nights, the sound of earth turning, the sound of time passing. A hedgehog shuffled through the grass, its nose to the ground, searching, not urgently, just searching, small feet padding, soft sounds. It found a beetle, ate it, continued on. Above the meadow, bats were flying, swooping and diving, catching insects mid-flight. Their wings made no sound. Their calls could not be heard by human ears, but they were calling, constantly calling, listening to echoes, building a picture of the world through sound. One bat missed an insect. It did not matter. There would be another, and another. The night was full of them. The bat flew on, confident, assured. It had done this 1,000,000 times. Its ancestors had done this for 1,000,000 years. In the ocean, far from any shore, whales were singing deep songs, songs that traveled for miles, through water, through darkness, through cold. Other whales heard them, understood them, answered them. What were they saying? No one knew. Perhaps they were not saying anything. Perhaps song did not need meaning. Perhaps it simply was. The whales swam slowly, enormous bodies moving through water like clouds moving through sky. Grace that seemed impossible, but was real, was natural. Around them, smaller fish swam, schools of fish, moving as one, turning together, diving together, rising together, one mind, one body, protection in numbers, safety in movement. Below them, the ocean floor stretched dark and empty, mountains down there, valleys, canyons deeper than any on land, places where no light had ever reached, where pressure crushed everything, where life should not exist, but it did exist. Strange life, blind fish, glowing creatures, things that looked alien, things that looked prehistoric, all adapted, all surviving, all perfect for where they were. A whale dove deeper, down and down, holding its breath. Its heart slowed, its blood redistributed, its body adapted to pressure. It reached the bottom, touched it gently, then rose again, toward light, toward air, toward the surface it needed but could never stay on. On the planet's other side, dawn was breaking, slowly breaking. The horizon glowed, not bright yet, just a suggestion of light, a promise. Birds began to wake, one by one. Calls started, tentative at first, then stronger, then a chorus, the dawn chorus, as old as birds themselves. A rooster crowed, then another, then dozens, announcing day, claiming territory, saying, I am here, I am alive, I matter. But to the universe, it did not matter. The universe did not care about roosters, did not care about announcements. The universe simply continued, as it always had, as it always would. The sun rose over fields, over forests, over cities and mountains and deserts and seas. Light touched everything, slowly, patiently, thoroughly. Shadows shifted, changed position, grew shorter. The world became visible again. Details emerged, colors returned, sharpness replaced softness. But the night side of the planet was still dark. Would be dark for hours yet. Time zones, rotation, the simple mechanics of a spinning sphere. One side always dark, one side always light. The line between them always moving. In the desert, the sand was warming. The cold of night was fading. Soon it would be hot, unbearably hot. But for now, it was perfect. Cool but warming, gentle. The lizard emerged from its burrow, climbed onto a rock, spread itself flat, absorbing warmth, preparing for the day. It did not think about this. It simply did it. Instinct. Millions of years of instinct. The cactus flower opened, bright pink against green, spectacular, wasteful in a desert, but not wasteful. Birds would come, insects would come, pollination would happen, seeds would form, the cycle would continue. A vulture circled high above, wings spread wide, not flapping, simply soaring, using thermals, hot air rising. The bird rode them higher and higher. Its eyes scanned the ground, searching, always searching, for death, for life, for whatever came. In the forest, light filtered through leaves, green light, yellow light, dappled patterns on the ground, beautiful, complex, ever-changing as leaves moved, as sun moved, as earth turned. The deer and its fawn were grazing, peaceful, unworried. The night had passed, a new day had come. That was all, that was everything. The river flowed on. It had flowed all night. It would flow all day. It would flow tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, until mountains eroded, until courses changed, until continents shifted. But that was millions of years away. For now, it simply flowed. The wolf stretched, yawned, showing teeth, not a threat, simply a yawn. It stood, shook itself, looked around. The tree, the plain, the hills, all familiar, all unchanged. It trotted off, toward the hills, toward water, toward whatever the day would bring. The tree remained. It had watched the wolf sleep. It had watched the wolf wake. It had watched the wolf leave. The tree had watched many things for many years. It would watch many more. Trees were good at watching. In space, the planet continued turning. Day followed night. Night followed day. Season followed season. Year followed year. On and on. Endless, but not meaningless. Simply endless. The moon orbited, the sun burned, the stars shone, the galaxies turned, the universe expanded, slowly, surely, without purpose, without plan, but with pattern, with structure, with something like intention, though it was not intention. And everywhere, everywhere, things were simply existing, being, living and dying, changing and remaining, all of it together, all of it separate, all of it now, all of it eternal. The person at the window finally went to bed. The light clicked off. The city grew darker, one less point of light among millions. The cat in the window curled up, tucked its head under its paw, slept. The child stirred but did not wake, turned over, continued sleeping, continued dreaming, dreams that would be forgotten, but while they lasted, were real. The old man's breathing grew even deeper. His hands relaxed, his face softened. Peace, complete peace, the peace of deep sleep, the peace of a life well lived, the peace of simply being. Morning came fully now, sunlight bright and clear, the world visible in sharp detail, but something was lost too. The softness of night, the mystery, the quiet. Day was for doing, night was for being, and soon night would come again. It always did. The planet would turn its face from the sun, darkness would return, stars would appear, the moon would rise, and everything would slow again, would quiet again, would simply exist again. Because nothing in the universe was in a hurry. Nothing ever had been. Nothing ever would be. The stars held their places. The planet turned. The moon orbited. Light traveled, darkness waited, and somewhere, someone was falling asleep. Their breathing slowed, their thoughts faded, their body relaxed. They were drifting away from worry, away from thought, away from everything, into sleep, deep sleep, safe sleep. The universe watched, silent, patient, endless. And in that universe, on that planet, in that moment, everything was exactly as it should be. Nothing needed to change. Nothing needed to happen. Everything was simply being. Too small to see without effort, moved through the soil. They burrowed, they rested, they continued the slow work of turning earth into earth. This had been happening for so long that the ground itself was made of their labor. But they did not know this. They simply moved, then rested, then moved again. The night air above the ground was cool, not cold, just cool. It touched the surface of leaves. It moved between blades of grass. It carried no message. It simply moved, the way air moves, filling the spaces it found and asking nothing of them. Insects clung to the underside of leaves. Their small bodies were still. Some of them had wings folded against themselves. Others had no wings at all. They waited for nothing. They simply remained, holding on to the surfaces beneath them, existing in the way that small things exist, quietly, without weight. The grass itself stood in the darkness, each blade separate, each blade the same. They did not grow during the night. They simply stood, holding the shape they had found, bending slightly when the air moved, then returning to stillness. This required no effort. It was simply what happened. Stones lay where they had always lain, in fields, in rivers, half buried in earth. They were cold now. During the day, some of them had been warm, but they did not remember warmth. They simply were cold, and this was neither good nor bad. The darkness rested on them the way it rested on everything else, without preference. Water moved in rivers, but slowly, more slowly than during the day, though the difference was small. The current pulled gently at stones on the riverbed. The stones did not resist. They had been smoothed by water over years so long that the years themselves had become meaningless. The water moved on, the stones remained. Both were content. Lakes held their water without effort. The surface was dark and still. Sometimes wind touched it and small ripples formed. Then the wind passed and the ripples faded and the the surface was still again. Beneath the surface, the water was layered. Cold water at the bottom, warmer water above. But even the warm water was cool. Everything was cool in the night. The moon continued its slow arc across the sky. It did not climb or descend. It simply moved through its path, the same path it had followed the night before and the night before that. Its light fell on the earth without force. Soft light, gray light. It touched the surface of the oceans, and the oceans absorbed it. It touched the deserts, and the sand held it briefly, then released it. Shadows lay across the land, long shadows, shadows of mountains, shadows of trees, shadows of small stones. The shadows did not move unless the thing that cast them moved, and most things were still. So the shadows were still also. They were not separate from the darkness. They were simply darker places within it. In the forests, moss grew on the north side of trees. It grew so slowly that even if someone watched for a lifetime, they would not see it grow. But it grew, cell by cell, slowly, in the darkness, in the light. It made no difference to the moss. It simply continued, soft and green and patient. Tree roots reached deep into the earth, deeper than the trees were tall. They spread in patterns that mirrored the branches above, though they would never see those branches. The roots drew water from the soil, not quickly, just steadily, the way they had always drawn it. The trees did not thank the roots. The roots did not expect thanks. It was simply what happened. Fungi spread through the forest floor in networks too fine to see. They connected tree to tree, root to root. Information passed through them, but slowly, so slowly that it was almost the same as not passing at all. The fungi did not hurry the information along. They simply existed between things, connecting what had always been separate, making separation meaningless. Fallen logs lay where they had fallen. Some had fallen years ago. Some had fallen decades ago. It made no difference. They were all returning to the earth at the same slow pace. Insects lived inside them. Mushrooms grew from them. Rain soaked into them and then dried. This cycle repeated, and with each repetition, the logs became softer, smaller, until eventually they would not be logs anymore. But that would take time, and time was not in a hurry. The earth turned beneath the stars, and the stars did not mark its turning. They burned with the same light they had burned with for millions of years. Some of them were already dead. The light that reached the earth now had left their surfaces before humans had learned to speak. But the light did not know this. It simply traveled. It had been traveling for so long that traveling was all it knew. Nebulae hung in the space between stars, clouds of gas and dust. Some of them were birthplaces for new stars, but birth on cosmic scales takes millions of years. There was no suddenness to it. Gas collapsed under its own weight. Slowly, pressure built. Slowly. Eventually, if enough time passed, a star would ignite. But even ignition in space was slow. A gradual brightening, not a spark. Other nebulae were the remnants of stars that had died. They had expelled their outer layers into space, creating clouds of glowing gas. Red, blue, green. The colors were soft. They spread across light years. The gas drifted outward, expanding, growing thinner and thinner. Eventually it would disperse completely. But that would take time, more time than anything on Earth could measure. Black holes sat at the centers of galaxies. They pulled everything toward them. Light, gas, dust, even time. But they did not pull suddenly. They simply existed, and their gravity simply acted, and things simply fell toward them. Slowly at first, then faster. But even the faster falling took years. The black holes did not hunger. They did not consume. They simply were, and things simply fell. Around the black holes, accretion disks spiraled, hot gas moving in circles that would never close. The gas glowed with the heat of its own friction. Bright light. But from far enough away, even that bright light was just another soft glow in the darkness. Just another star among stars. The universe itself was expanding. Not quickly, just steadily. Every point moving away from every other point. The expansion had been happening for so long that it had become the natural state of things. Galaxies drifted apart. The space between them grew. But the galaxies did not notice. They simply moved, held together by gravity within, while the universe pulled them apart without. This expansion would continue. It would continue for longer than stars would burn, longer than planets would exist, universe would be so spread out that each galaxy would be alone in the darkness, too far from any other galaxy to see it. But that was still a long time away, so far away that even light could not imagine the distance. For now, the galaxies remained visible to each other, moving through the darkness in their slow procession. Some were moving toward collision, but even collision between galaxies was gentle. It took millions of years. Stars passed through each other without touching. The space between stars was so vast that even when galaxies merged, most of the individual stars never came close to another star. The Earth turned through all of this without awareness. It held its small atmosphere close. The atmosphere was thin. If the Earth were an apple, the atmosphere would be thinner than the apple's skin. But it was enough. It held the air. It held the warmth. It allowed life to continue. That life rested now. Even the plants rested, though they had no eyes to close. Their leaves had stopped making food when the sun set. Now they simply breathed, taking in air, releasing it. The exchange was slow, peaceful. The plants did not count their breaths. In the soil, seeds waited. Some had been waiting for years. They were not impatient. They simply waited, holding inside themselves the pattern of what they would become. When the right conditions came, they would begin. But until then, they remained as they were. Dry, hard, complete. Roots of sleeping plants held the soil together. They kept the earth from washing away when rain fell. They did this without trying. It was simply what happened when roots existed in soil. The roots did not know they were keeping anything together. They simply reached for water, and in reaching, they held. Underground, water moved through stone, through cracks too small to see, through pores in rock. It moved so slowly that a single drop might take 100 years to travel a mile. But it moved, following gravity, finding the spaces between things. Eventually, if enough time passed, it would emerge somewhere as a spring. But time did not matter to the water. It simply continued. The springs that already existed flowed gently, water bubbling up from deep in the earth. Cold water, clear water. It tasted of the minerals it had passed through. Iron, calcium, stone. The water flowed into streams, and the streams flowed into rivers, and the rivers flowed into the sea. This had been happening for so long that the path was was worn smooth. The sea accepted all water. It did not matter if the water came from springs or rain or melted snow. The sea held it all. Salt mixed with fresh, cold mixed with warm. Eventually, everything became the same. The sea did not work to mix these things. Currents did it. Time did it. And both currents and time moved without effort. Deep in the sea, where no light reached, creatures moved through the darkness. They had never seen light. They had never known light existed. They found their food by touch, by smell, by senses that had no names. They did not think of themselves as living in darkness. They simply lived, and the darkness was simply where they lived. The pressure at those depths was enormous. It would crush anything from the surface. But the creatures there had been born into that pressure. Their bodies were made for it. They did not feel crushed. They felt nothing unusual. This was simply what existence felt like to them. Volcanic vents on the ocean floor released hot water into the cold sea. The water was thick with minerals. Bacteria clustered around the vents, feeding on the chemicals. Larger creatures came to feed on the bacteria. This was one of the few places on Earth where life did not depend on the sun. The creatures there had built their existence around heat from deep in the earth instead. But they did not know they were different. They simply were. The earth's core remained hot as the surface of the sun. But that heat was buried deep, beneath miles of rock, beneath the oceans, beneath the continents. It radiated outward, slowly, warming the rock around it. The rock conducted the heat upward, inch by inch, year by year. Eventually, the heat reached the surface, but by then it was diffused, gentle, just enough to keep the world warm. Magma moved slowly through chambers deep underground. It pressed against rock. Sometimes the rock broke and the magma pushed through. But even that pushing was slow, measured in centuries. Volcanoes built themselves grain by grain, layer by layer. There was no urgency to their growth. The plates that made up the Earth's crust moved across the surface, but they moved slowly, a few inches per year, slower than fingernails grew. They collided with each other, and mountains rose. They pulled apart, and oceans formed. But these events took millions of years, and during those millions of years, nothing felt sudden. Mountains stood tall, but they were wearing away. Wind removed them, grain by grain. Rain dissolved them, molecule by molecule. Ice split them apart when water froze in their cracks. But this destruction was so slow that the mountains seemed eternal. They did not feel themselves disappearing. They simply stood, and the wearing away simply happened. The wind that wore them away came from differences in temperature. Warm air rising, cold air sinking, air flowing from high pressure to low. The Earth's rotation curved the wind's path, but the wind did not mind being curved. It simply blew from somewhere to somewhere else, carrying dust, carrying moisture, carrying nothing. Clouds formed when that moisture condensed, tiny droplets gathering around tinier particles of dust. The droplets were too small to fall. They simply floated. Billions of them together made a cloud. The cloud moved with the wind, changing shape, spreading out, gathering together. But it was never trying to become anything. It simply changed because changing was what it did. Sometimes the droplets in the clouds grew heavy enough to fall. Rain began, each drop falling separately, pulled by gravity, accelerating, then reaching a terminal velocity and falling at that same speed until it struck something. The ground, a leaf, a stone, the surface of the water. The rain did not choose where it fell. It simply fell. The rain soaked into the earth or ran across the surface. It filled the rivers. It collected in puddles that would evaporate when the sun returned. The cycle was old, so old that the water falling now had fallen before, many times before. It had been rain and rivers and oceans and vapor and clouds and rain again. The water did not remember its previous forms. It simply existed in its current one. Ice formed in the coldest places, at the poles, on mountaintops, in the highest clouds. Water molecules arranging themselves in crystalline patterns, six-sided, symmetric, beautiful in a way that required no observer. The ice formed slowly, layer by layer, year by year. In some places, the ice was miles thick. It held within it bubbles of ancient air. But the ice did not know the air was ancient. It simply held it. The glaciers at the poles crept slowly toward the sea, moving under their own weight, inches per year. When they reached the water, pieces broke off, icebergs, melting slowly in the warmer water. By the time they disappeared, they might have traveled thousands of miles. But they did not travel to get anywhere. They simply moved. And then they were gone. The stars above the poles never set. They circled the sky instead, around and around, marking the Earth's rotation. But at the poles, there was no east or west, only the spin, only the circle. The stars did not grow dizzy. They simply moved through their path, the same path, always. Between the poles and the equator, the stars rose and set. They appeared in the east. They climbed across the sky. They disappeared in the west. This happened every night, had happened every night since anyone had been watching, would happen every night after everyone stopped. The stars did not perform this movement. It was simply how they appeared from a turning earth. Constellations held their shapes, the same shapes they had held for thousands of years, patterns that ancient people had named. But the stars in those patterns were not actually close to each other. They were separated by light years. They simply appeared close from Earth's perspective. They did not know they were part of a pattern. They simply burned, separate, distant, unaware. Some of those stars had planets of their own, worlds circling other suns. Some were hot, some were cold, some were gas, some were rock. Most had no life. They simply existed, turning, orbiting, following gravity's gentle insistence. A few of those worlds might have had life, different from Earth's life, but still life, still something that grew, that changed, that ended. But those living things, if they existed, were too far away to ever meet life from Earth. The distances were too vast. Even light took years to cross them, and living things were slower than light. So life on Earth remained alone. Not lonely, just alone, doing what life does, growing, changing, ending, beginning again. The cycle was automatic. No one had started it. No one directed it. It simply was, and in being, it continued. The sleeping humans on the sleeping earth were part of that cycle. They breathed, their hearts beat, cells divided, cells died. The balance was maintained without thought. The body knew what to do. It had been refined over millions of years of small changes. Each change so small, it was almost not a change. But together, over time, they had created something that could breathe, The thinking had stopped for the night. The minds rested. Consciousness had folded itself away like a bird folding its wings. What remained was simpler. The body's knowledge. The old knowledge. The knowledge of breathing and heartbeat, and the slow repair of tired tissue. Dreams still moved through the sleeping minds, but even dreams were quieter now. Less story, more image, fragments, a face, a place, a feeling without name. They came and went like clouds. They meant nothing. They meant everything. It was the same. The neurons that created those dreams fired in patterns. Electrical signals moving through wet tissue. Chemistry and physics cooperating to create something that felt like thought, but was not quite thought. The brain was maintaining itself, testing its connections, making sure everything still worked. This happened every night. It would happen tomorrow night. It had happened last night. The blood moved through vessels, pushed by the heart. The heart contracted and relaxed, contracted and relaxed. A rhythm so steady it was like silence. The blood carried oxygen to where it was needed, carried waste away. The blood did not know what it carried. It simply flowed. The lungs expanded and compressed. Air moved in, air moved out. Oxygen crossed from air into blood through membranes so thin they were almost not there. The exchange was efficient, quiet. It had been perfected over hundreds of millions of years. The lungs did not know they were perfect. They simply breathed. The skin held everything inside. It was a border, but a gentle border. It let some things through. Water vapor, heat. It kept other things out. But it did not guard aggressively. It simply was a surface, the place where the body ended and the world began, or where the world ended and the body began. It was the same border, seen from different sides. Hair grew slowly from the skin. Fingernails grew slowly from the fingers. Both were dead tissue, but they grew nonetheless. The body producing more of itself even while it slept, even while it rested. Growth was constant, slow, mostly invisible, but constant. The stomach digested food that had been eaten hours ago, breaking it down, separating what was useful from what was not. The intestines absorbed nutrients. Bacteria in the intestines helped with the work. They had always been there. They were part of the body, but not part of the body. Separate creatures living inside, necessary creatures. The body did not mind their presence. They were simply there. The liver filtered blood. The kidneys filtered blood. Over and over. All night. All day. Always. They removed what should not be there. They balanced what should. They did this without being asked, without praise, without thought. They simply did what they had evolved to do. Bones held the body's shape. They were hard, but not brittle. They were alive, but seemed like stone. Cells within them constantly broke down old bone and built new bone. The skeleton was always being remade, slowly, over months and years, but it was never not itself. Even while changing, it remained. Muscles lay slack in sleep, not completely relaxed, but close. They maintained just enough tension to hold joints in place, to keep the body from collapsing. But the work they did now was minimal. They rested, repaired themselves, prepared for the movement that would come when waking came. But waking was still hours away. The night was not finished. The earth had more turning to do. The stars had more of their slow arc to trace. The moon had not yet reached its high point in the sky. Everything was still in the middle of its cycle. The middle of the cycle was not different from the beginning or the end. It was just the part that was happening now. And now was all there ever was. The past had already stopped existing. The future had not begun to exist. Only now remained, and now was quiet. The ocean continued its breathing. In, out. In, out. Waves rolled toward shore. They broke. They retreated. Another wave came. It was always another wave. The waves did not count themselves. They simply came, one after another, without end. Tides pulled the water up the beach, then released it. The moon's gravity made this happen, but the moon did not pull intentionally. It simply had mass, and mass had gravity, and gravity pulled. This was automatic, mechanical, but beautiful nonetheless. The beauty did not require intention. Small creatures lived in the wet sand at the tide line. They burrowed down when the water retreated. They rose up when it returned. Their lives were measured by this rhythm. High tide, low tide. They had no other way to mark time, and they needed no other way. Seabirds rested on the cliffs above the shore, their heads tucked, their feathers arranged against the wind. They would wake before the human rise into the air when the first light came. But that was not yet, for now they simply rested, held to the cliff face by their grip, by their balance, by their long practice of sleeping while perched. The wind moved differently over the ocean than it did over land. Steadier, less interrupted. It blew across the surface, and the surface responded with waves. The waves moved in the direction the wind blew, but the water itself did not move forward. Only the energy moved forward. The wave form. The water simply rose and fell in place, circling, never traveling. Beneath the surface, currents did move the water, great loops of circulation, warm water moving toward the poles, cold water moving toward the equator. The currents were driven by wind, by the Earth's rotation, by differences in temperature and salt. They moved constantly, day and night, summer and winter. They had been moving for thousands of years. They would move for thousands more. The salt in the ocean came from the land. Rain fell on mountains. Water dissolved minerals from rock. Rivers carried those dissolved minerals to the sea. The sea held them. Over millions of years, the sea had become salty. Over millions more years, it would become saltier still. But the change was too slow to taste, too slow to notice. The ocean simply was what it was. Fish in the ocean did not taste the salt. They had evolved in salt water. Their bodies expected it, needed it. Without it, they could not balance the water in their cells. The salt was not something separate from them. It was part of their environment, part of what made them possible. Whales breached in distant parts of the ocean. Not often, but sometimes. They rose from the water, their massive bodies briefly airborne. Then they fell back with a crash that echoed across the waves. Why they did this, no one knew. Perhaps it felt good. Perhaps it removed parasites. Perhaps there was no reason. They simply did it. And then they dove again, back into the deep, back into the quiet. The deep was quiet. Sound moved well through water. But in the deep, there were fewer sounds to move, fewer creatures, fewer collisions. Just the occasional click of a whale's echolocation, the occasional rumble of shifting tectonic plates, the occasional whisper of falling sediment. But mostly, quiet. Sediment fell constantly in the deep. Tiny particles, remains of creatures that had died near the surface, dust that had blown from land, minerals dissolving from rocks. falling, slowly, taking weeks to reach the bottom, building up on the ocean floor, layer by layer. Eventually, with enough time and enough pressure, those layers would become stone, sedimentary rock. The history of the ocean pressed into solid form, but that transformation took millions of years. For now, the sediment was just sediment, soft, loose, home to creatures that burrowed through it, creatures with no eyes, creatures that had never needed eyes. The earth turned. Always the earth turned. The turning created day and night. The turning created weather patterns. The turning created ocean currents. But the earth did not turn to create these things. The earth simply turned. And these were the consequences. Natural, automatic, inevitable. The moon circled the earth. The earth circled the sun. The sun circled the galaxy. The galaxy moved through the universe. Everything was always moving. But from inside the movement, everything felt still. The movement was too large, too constant. It became the same as stillness. Mountains stood in the moonlight. Their peaks touched the sky. Snow clung to the highest slopes. Ice filled the high valleys. Below the snowline, bare rock showed through. Gray, black, brown, the colors of stone. The rock was cold at night. It radiated the day's warmth back into the atmosphere. By morning, it would be colder still. Nothing lived on the highest peaks. The wind was too strong, the air too thin, the cold too deep. But the peaks did not mourn the absence of life. They simply stood. They had stood for millions of years. They would stand for millions more. Though each year they were slightly smaller, slightly more eroded, the wind and ice removing them grain by grain. Lower on the mountain, trees grew at the tree line, stunted trees, bent by wind, growing slowly in the thin soil. They flowered late. Their growing season was short, but they persisted, each year adding another thin ring of growth. The rings were so thin, they were hard to count, but they were there. Evidence of time, evidence of persistence. Below the tree line, forests thickened. The trees grew taller, straighter. Their roots went deeper. More life existed here, more varieties of life. But even here, at night, everything rested. The forest was still, quiet, just the occasional sound of something small moving through the undergrowth. a sound so soft it was almost not a sound. Valleys lay between mountains. Rivers ran through them. The water in those rivers came from melting snow, from springs, from rain. It flowed downhill because that was what water did, following gravity, finding the lowest path. The water was cold, clear. It tasted of stone and snow. People had built villages in some of those valleys, small clusters of homes. The homes were dark now, the people inside sleeping. Fires that had burned during the day had been banked for the night. Just coals now, just warmth, no light. The coals would last until morning, until someone woke and added wood and brought the fire back. In other valleys, there were no people. There had never been people. The valleys simply existed, carved by ancient glaciers, filled with meadows, filled with streams. Elk grazed in those meadows during the day. At night, they lay down, chewing their cud, resting, their large eyes reflecting what little light there was. Predators existed too, but they were not hunting now. Even predators rested. A wolf pack slept in a den, bodies pressed together, warm. The alpha pair in the center, the others arranged around them. Their bellies were full from an earlier kill. They needed nothing. They simply slept. Bears slept in caves, or in hollow logs, or beneath overturned roots. Their sleep was deeper now than it had been in summer, moving toward hibernation, their heart rates slowing, their breathing slowing. They would sleep for months, waking occasionally, shifting position, then sleeping again. The winter was long, but their bodies knew how to wait. Smaller animals slept in burrows, underground where it was warmer. They had gathered food before the cold came, nuts, seeds, roots. Now they simply waited, eating a little, sleeping a lot. The cold was above them, but they were beneath it, protected by earth. The earth itself was a blanket. It insulated. It kept the temperature below ground stable, while the surface froze and thawed with the seasons. The deep earth remained the same temperature year-round. Life underground did not experience seasons the way life on the surface did. It experienced only the slow constancy of stone and soil. Insects had laid eggs before the cold came. The adults had died, but the eggs remained, frozen or nearly frozen, waiting. When warmth returned, they would hatch, but warmth was months away. For now, They simply waited, suspended, not alive in the way active things are alive, but not dead, just waiting. The waiting required nothing from them. They did not count the days. They did not wonder when warmth would come. They simply were. And when conditions changed, they would respond to those conditions automatically, not by choice, by design, by the patterns written into them before they were born. The moon had passed its highest point. Now it descended slowly toward the western horizon. In a few hours, it would set. But a few hours was still a long time. Long enough for the moon to move through a significant arc of sky. Long enough for shadows to shift across the land. The light from the moon was reflected sunlight. The sun illuminated half of the moon's surface. The other half remained dark. But both halves were the same, made of the same rock, marked by the same craters. The division between light and dark was arbitrary, temporary. As the moon moved, the line between them moved. In 2 weeks, the sides would be reversed. The sides would be reversed, but the moon would not notice the reversal. It would simply continue, reflecting what light reached it, holding what darkness touched it. The darkness between stars was not empty. It held dust, gas, particles so small and so spread out that calling them anything at all seemed wrong. But they were there, drifting, moving through the void at speeds that had no reference point. Fast or slow meant nothing where there was nothing to measure against. Some of that dust would eventually gather, slowly, pulled by gravity so weak it was almost not there. Over millions of years, the dust would become denser, then denser still. Eventually, perhaps, it would collapse into something, a star, a planet. But that was so far in the future that even the universe was patient about it. The universe had no need for hurry. It had already existed for billions of years. It would exist for billions more, trillions perhaps. The numbers were too large to hold meaning. They simply indicated a very long time, longer than anything could wait. But the universe was not waiting. It was simply existing. In that existence, the earth was small, smaller than small. A single grain of sand on a beach that stretched forever. But the earth did not know it was small. It simply turned, simply held its atmosphere, simply allowed its surface to be covered with water and life and stone. The stone was old, some of it older than life, some of it older than the oceans. It had been melted and cooled and broken and buried and lifted and worn away. And all of this had happened so many times that the stone itself was a record of the earth's long memory. But the stone did not remember. It simply was. Crystals formed inside some of that stone, deep underground, where pressure and heat worked slowly. Atoms arranged themselves in patterns, regular patterns, geometric. The crystals grew, one layer of atoms at a time. It took thousands of years to grow an inch, but the crystals did not measure their growth. They simply grew when conditions allowed, stopped growing when conditions changed. Some of those crystals would never be seen. They would remain buried, forever perhaps, or until the earth's mantle swallowed them again, melted them back into formless rock. The cycle would begin once more. But there was no loss in this. The crystals were not trying to be found. They simply were. Hidden or not hidden made no difference. Other crystals had been brought to the surface by volcanic activity, by erosion, by the slow uplift of mountains. They lay in riverbeds now, tumbled smooth by water, their geometric patterns worn away on the outside. But inside, the pattern remained perfect, unchanged, waiting for nothing. Rivers continued their movement. They had been moving since the rain that fed them had fallen. Some of that rain had fallen weeks ago. Some had fallen months ago. But it was all moving now. Downhill. Always downhill. Seeking the sea, not because the sea called to it, but because downhill was the only direction gravity allowed. The rivers carried more than water. They carried soil, silt, clay, particles suspended in the current. The water was brown with it in places, clear in others. The difference depended on what the river was moving through. Stone made clear water. Soil made brown water. But the water itself did not change. Only what it carried changed. At the river's mouth, where it met the sea, the water slowed. The particles it carried settled, dropped to the bottom, built up year after year. Deltas formed, new land made from old mountains. The land grew slowly, imperceptibly, but it grew. Plants colonized the new land. Seeds arrived on the wind, or floated on the water, or were carried in the droppings of birds. The seeds sprouted, roots went down, stems went up. The plants did not know they were pioneers. They simply grew where they landed. Marshes formed where the river met the sea. Neither fully river nor fully sea. Salt water mixed with fresh, brackish. Reeds grew tall in the shallow water. Their roots held the soil. Their stems swayed in the wind. Birds nested in them. Fish hid among them. The marsh was neither one thing nor another. It was both, and it was neither. Life thrived in that in-between place. More varieties of life than in the forest, more than in the open ocean. The marsh was rich, fertile, full of food and shelter and quiet places. But it did not try to be rich. It simply was, and life responded to what it was. At night, the marsh was still. The birds silent in their nests. The fish motionless in the shallow water. Even the insects that hummed during the day had quieted. Just the water moving, just the reeds swaying, just the soft sounds of a place that was neither awake nor asleep. The tide crept higher. Slowly, the water level rose, filled channels, covered mud. The change was so gradual that watching it felt like watching nothing. But it was happening. The moon's gravity pulled. The water responded, as it always had, as it always would. On distant shores, the tide was going out, the water retreating, exposing rocks, exposing sand. The same moon, the same gravity. But the curve of the earth meant that what was high tide here was low tide there. Balance. The water did not leave the earth. It simply redistributed itself constantly, quietly. Shells lay scattered on the exposed sand, empty shells. The creatures that had lived in them had died, been eaten, washed away. Now just the shells remained. Calcium carbonate formed layer by layer during the creature's life, hard enough to survive the creature's death. The shells would last for years, maybe decades. Eventually the waves would grind them into sand, but that was still a long time away. Sand itself was the remnant of stone, quartz mostly, other minerals, ground down by water and wind and time. Each grain had once been part of something larger, a mountain perhaps, a boulder, a pebble. Now it was sand, and one day it would be smaller than sand, silt, then clay, then something so fine it had no name. The wind moved across the beach. It lifted some of the sand, carried it, dropped it elsewhere. Dunes formed, grain by grain. The dunes moved, slowly, migrating inland, covering what had been there before, but moving so slowly that nothing alive noticed the movement. Grasses grew on the stable dunes. Their roots held the sand in place, stopped the migration. The dunes became fixed, permanent, in the way that anything on earth was permanent, which was to say, not permanent at all, just stable for now. The sky above the beach was vast, more stars visible here than in the cities. The darkness was deeper, the air clearer. The stars seemed closer, though they were the same distance they always were. Distance did not change with perception. Only the appearance of distance changed. Some of the stars visible now would not be visible in 6 months. The Earth would have moved to the other side of its orbit. Different stars would be in the night sky, but the stars that disappeared would not be gone. They would simply be in the day sky, invisible behind the sun's light, still there, still burning, just unseen. The sun was on the other side of the earth now, illuminating other continents, other oceans, warming other faces, but warming them gently, the way morning light warms, soft, gradual, giving time to adjust. But for the side of the earth in darkness, morning was still hours away. The night was not half over, maybe not even a third over. Time moved at the same pace it always moved, which was to say, it did not move at all. Only things moved through time. Time itself simply was. a dimension, a background, a stage on which everything happened. The continents drifted on that stage, slowly, carried by convection currents in the mantle beneath them. The currents moved the way water moves in a pot that is heating, slowly, rising in some places, sinking in others, circulating. The continents rode those currents, millimeters per year. But those millimeters added up. Over millions of years, the continents had been in very different places. They would be in different places again in another 100 million years, maybe less. The Atlantic would be wider, the Pacific narrower, or perhaps the opposite. The details did not matter. What mattered was that everything was always moving, always changing. Even the things that seemed most permanent were temporary. Mountains rose and wore away. Oceans opened and closed. Species emerged and went extinct. Climates changed. Ice ages came and went. But all of this happened so slowly that any single moment felt stable, permanent, still. And in this particular moment, the earth was still. The oceans breathed. The continents drifted. The mountains wore away. But all of it was so slow that it might as well have been stillness. A satellite passed overhead, man-made, metal, reflecting sunlight even though it was night on the ground. The satellite moved quickly relative to the Earth's surface, but quickly for a satellite was still slow compared to light, slow compared to the Earth's rotation. It was just another thing moving through space, falling, actually, falling around the Earth. Its forward motion balanced against Earth's gravity, the two forces creating an orbit. There were many satellites, some watching the weather, some transmitting signals, some just measuring, recording, storing data that someone might look at later, or might not. The satellites did not care if anyone looked at the data. They simply collected it, did what they were designed to do, then transmitted it back to Earth. The signals they sent moved at the speed of light, but even light took a fraction of a second to reach the ground. Not long, but not instant. Nothing was instant across distance. Everything took time. Even light. The deepest space probes were much farther away, beyond the planets, beyond the asteroid belt, heading toward the edge of the solar system. They would take years to get there, decades. They would send back data the entire way. Data about magnetic fields, about particle density, about things so subtle that only instruments could detect them. Eventually, those probes would leave the solar system entirely. They would enter interstellar space, the space between stars. They would drift there forever, moving too slowly to ever reach another star, carrying messages from Earth that no one would ever read. The probes did not know this. They simply continued, broadcasting their data until their power sources died, then continuing in silence. Silence was the natural state of space. Sound required air, required something to vibrate. In space, there was nothing, or almost nothing, too little to carry vibration. So even the most violent events in space were silent. Stars exploding, black holes colliding, galaxies merging. All of it happened without sound. The Earth moved through that silence, carrying its thin envelope of air. Within that air, sound existed. Wind made sound. Water made sound. Life made sound. But from space, the Earth was silent. Just another world, turning, orbiting, reflecting light. The light it reflected came from the sun, 8 minutes old by the time it reached Earth, 8 minutes older still by the time it bounced off the clouds and returned to space. That light would travel forever, growing weaker, spreading out, but never stopping. In 1 billion years, some of that light would still be traveling, would have reached galaxies so far away that even the fastest spacecraft could never reach them. But that light would be unimaginably faint by then, indistinguishable from the background glow of the universe, lost in the noise. The light did not mind being lost. It simply traveled. It had no destination, no purpose. It simply moved at the speed that light moves, could not move any other speed. That was what light was, movement at that speed. The Earth's movement was slower, but still fast, spinning at 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, orbiting the sun at 67,000 miles per hour. But no one on Earth felt that speed. Movement at constant velocity felt like stillness. Only changes in velocity could be felt, and the Earth's velocity changed so gradually that the changes were imperceptible. Birds would feel the sunrise before humans. Their internal clocks were more precise, more tied to the light. They would wake in the darkness before dawn, would begin to sing, softly at first, then louder as more birds joined. The chorus would build, would fill the pre-dawn air with sound. But that was still in the future. For now, the birds slept, their small bodies conserving energy, their hearts beating fast even in sleep. Fast for such small creatures, but appropriate, necessary. The size of an animal determined so much. Heart rate, breathing rate, lifespan. Small creatures lived faster, died sooner, experienced more in less time. Larger creatures lived more slowly. Their hearts beat slower. They breathed less often. They lived longer. A whale's heart might beat 10 times per minute. A human's 60. A mouse's 600. But each creature experienced time in its own way. A mouse's short life might feel as full as a whale's long one. Trees lived longer still. Their heartbeat, if they had one, would be measured in years, decades, centuries. The oldest trees were thousands of years old. They had been alive when human civilizations were just beginning. They would still be alive when those civilizations were dust. The trees did not count the years. They simply grew, season after season, year after year, adding rings, adding height, adding mass. But even the oldest trees would die, eventually. Fire, disease, wind, something would take them down. And when they fell, they would feed the forest floor, would become soil, would become the nutrients that fed new trees. The cycle would continue. Nothing was wasted. Everything became something else. The forest floor was soft with the accumulation of years. Fallen leaves, fallen branches, fallen trees. All of it slowly decomposing, breaking down, returning to simpler forms. The process was not decay, not really. It was transformation. Everything that had been built up was being taken apart, slowly, carefully, by fungi, by bacteria, by insects, by time. Time was the ultimate solvent. Given enough of it, everything dissolved. Mountains became plains, oceans became deserts, life became stone, stone became dust, dust became something else. The transformations continued, would continue forever, or for as long as forever meant anything. Forever was a long time, longer than the age of the universe, longer than the future of the universe. But forever was also just a word, a concept. It meant more time than can be imagined, more time than matters, enough time for anything to happen. for nothing to matter and everything to matter simultaneously. But forever was not now. Now was just this moment, this breath, this heartbeat, this rotation of the earth, this position of the moon, this particular arrangement of stars in the sky. Now was specific, concrete, real. And in this now, the earth slept, the oceans breathed, the stars burned, the darkness held everything gently. Nothing was urgent, nothing was afraid. The universe simply continued, as it always had, as it always would. The moonlight touched the surface of a lake. The water was still, a mirror. The moon's reflection was perfect, not distorted, just smaller. The light had traveled from the sun to the moon, to the earth, to the lake, to the eye. Each step of the journey adding distance, adding time. But the light did not grow tired. It simply traveled. Beneath the mirror surface, fish hung suspended, not swimming, just existing. Their gills moved, their fins made small adjustments, but they were not going anywhere. They were simply being, somewhere in the middle of the water column, not at the surface, not at the bottom, just there. The lake bed was mud, soft mud, accumulated sediment from streams that fed the lake. The mud held the history of the lake, pollen grains from centuries ago, bits of charcoal from ancient fires, shells from creatures long dead, all of it pressed together, layer upon layer, a record that no one would read. The water in the lake would remain there for years, some of it. Other water would leave through the outlet stream, would continue its journey to the sea. New water would arrive from the inlet. The exchange was constant, but slow. The lake changed completely, molecule by molecule, every few years. But it always looked the same. Permanence was an illusion. Everything changed, but some things changed so slowly that they seemed permanent. The lake seemed permanent. The mountains seemed permanent. The stars seemed permanent. But none of them were. They were all temporary, all changing, just on time scales too long for brief human lives to perceive. But those brief human lives were not concerned with such things now. They were sleeping, resting, restoring themselves. They would wake eventually, would continue their brief dance of existence. But for now, they were still, quiet, part of the great stillness that covered the sleeping earth, and the earth turned. Through the darkness, through the silence, through the infinite patience of space, turned without effort, without thought, simply turned, as it always had, as it always would. The turning created a rhythm, but the rhythm was so slow that it felt like no rhythm at all, just continuousness, just the steady state of being. The stars above had witnessed this turning for billions of years. They would witness it for billions more, perhaps, or perhaps not. Stars died too, eventually, but their deaths took time. A star did not simply stop. It faded, or it swelled, or it collapsed. All of it slowly, all of it following patterns that had been set when the star was born. The birth of a star was slow too. Gas collapsing, taking millions of years. The pressure building, the heat building, until finally the temperature at the center became hot enough for fusion to begin. But even that beginning was gradual. Not a spark, just a slow brightening, a slow warming. The star did not suddenly exist. It emerged slowly from the darkness of the cloud that made it. And when stars died, they returned to darkness. Most of them. They cooled, they faded, they became dark remnants, cold spheres of dense matter, no longer shining, just existing, floating through space, invisible unless something passed close enough to feel their gravity. Some stars died differently. The massive ones. They collapsed and then exploded, supernovae, bright enough to outshine entire galaxies. But even those explosions were slow by human standards. They took hours, days. The brightness would build, would peak, then would fade over weeks, months, years. Even violence on cosmic scales was gentle. The elements that made up the earth had come from such explosions. Long ago, before the sun existed, before the earth existed, stars had lived and died. Their deaths had scattered heavy elements into space: carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, iron. All of it forged in the cores of stars, released when those stars died. Later, much later, that scattered material had gathered again, had formed a new cloud. The cloud had collapsed. The sun had formed. The planets had formed. The earth, made from the remnants of dead stars, recycled matter. Nothing was new. Everything was old, just rearranged. The atoms in the sleeping human bodies were old too, billions of years old. They had been part of stars, part of the interstellar medium, part of the nebula that became the solar system, part of the early Earth, part of rocks, part of water, part of ancient life, part of soil, part of food, now part of human bodies, tomorrow part of something else. Nothing was owned, not really. The atoms were just borrowed for a lifetime. Then they would be returned, breathed out, shed with dead skin, released when the body stopped, returned to the soil, to the air, to the water, to become part of something else. The cycle had no beginning, no end. It simply continued, matter transforming, energy transforming, but nothing being created, nothing being destroyed, just changing form, endlessly, patiently. The air that filled the sleeping lungs was old air, the same air that had existed for billions of years, the same nitrogen, the same oxygen, circulating through the atmosphere, breathed in, breathed out, absorbed by plants, released by plants, dissolved in ocean, released from ocean. The air went everywhere, was shared by everything. A single breath contained atoms that had been breathed by ancient humans, by dinosaurs, by the first creatures to emerge onto land. The atoms did not remember where they had been. They simply existed, available, moving through the cycles. Water was the same. The water in human bodies had been everywhere, had fallen as rain, had flowed in rivers, had circulated in oceans, had frozen in glaciers, had been drunk by countless creatures, had been released by countless creatures. The water remembered nothing. It simply flowed, cycled, continued. The ocean held most of the water, 97%. The remaining 3% was fresh water, but most of that was frozen in glaciers, in ice caps. Only a tiny fraction was available as liquid, fresh water. In lakes, in rivers, in the ground, in the air as vapor, in living bodies. That tiny fraction was enough. Enough for forests, enough for grasslands, enough for life. The water moved through all of it, connecting everything. A tree in a forest was connected to the ocean. The water in its leaves had come from rain. The rain had come from evaporated ocean. The water would return to the ocean, eventually, through rivers, through groundwater, through the slow underground seep. Everything was connected, not metaphorically, actually. The same matter, the same energy, the same atoms, circulating, connecting, making everything part of everything else. But the connections were gentle, not tight, not constraining, just there, like the gravity that connected the earth to the moon, always pulling, but gently, allowing movement, allowing distance, just keeping everything loosely bound. The moon moved away from the earth, slowly, a few centimeters each year, the distance between them growing. The earth's rotation was slowing too, not much, not noticeably, but it was slowing. Days were getting longer, microseconds per year, but over millions of years, the microseconds added up. Eventually, far in the future, the day would be as long as the month. The same side of the earth would always face the moon. The same side of the moon already faced the earth. Tidal locking. The moon's rotation matched its orbit, locked by Earth's gravity long ago. The Earth would be locked by the moon's gravity too, eventually. But that was millions of years away. For now, the Earth still turned freely, still showed all its sides to the sun, still cycled through day and night. The moon still circled, still showed all its phases, waxing, waning, new, full. The rhythm continued, would continue, for a long time yet. In the darkness, creatures that were neither asleep nor awake continued their slow existence. Single-celled organisms, bacteria, archaea, they lived everywhere, in soil, in water, in air, inside other creatures, on surfaces, in hot springs, in ice, in deep rock miles underground. They were too small to see, but they were numerous, more numerous than all other life combined. Their collective mass was greater than all plants, all animals. They had been the first life. They would probably be the last life. They were simple, but they had survived for billions of years. Simplicity was a kind of success. They reproduced by dividing, one cell becoming two, two becoming four. Exponential growth. But in practice, most died before reproducing. So populations stayed stable. Births balanced deaths. The balance was not planned. It simply emerged from the mathematics of limited resources. Some of them did not need oxygen, had never needed it. They had evolved before oxygen existed in the atmosphere. Back when the Earth's air was methane and ammonia and carbon dioxide. They still lived in places without oxygen. Deep mud, deep water, sealed away, living the way life had always lived. Before everything changed, the oxygen that filled the air now had come from life, from photosynthesis, from ancient bacteria that had learned to split water and release oxygen as waste. That waste had accumulated, had changed the atmosphere, had rusted the iron in rocks, had made the sky blue, had made complex life possible. But it had taken time, billions of years. The oxygen built up slowly, very slowly. For the first billion years, it reacted with iron and sulfur and was removed as fast as it was produced. Only after all the reactive materials were oxidized did oxygen begin to accumulate in the air. That accumulation had killed most of the life that existed then. Oxygen was poison to organisms adapted to a world without it. They died or retreated to places without oxygen. The world changed. New life evolved. Life that used oxygen. Life that thrived on what had been poison. Another transformation. Another cycle. Death making room for life. The old making way for the new. But the old did not disappear completely. It persisted in hidden places, in deep places, continuing as it always had, unchanged. Nothing ever completely disappeared. It just became rare, became hidden, became the exception rather than the rule. But it continued, somewhere, somehow. The mountains continued standing. The rivers continued flowing. The oceans continued their slow breathing. The tides rose, the tides fell. The waves came, the waves went. The rhythm was older than memory, older than stone, older than the continents themselves. And through it all, the earth turned, slowly, steadily, without pause, without rest, carrying its burden of life, its burden of water, its burden of air, carrying all of it through the darkness, through the silence, through the vast emptiness between here and everywhere else. The emptiness was not empty, not truly. It held vacuum, but even vacuum had energy, quantum fluctuations, particles appearing and disappearing, existing for briefer than brief moments, too brief to be measured, too brief to matter. But they were there, even in the emptiest space, even in the deepest void. Something was always happening, but that something was so subtle, so quiet, that it might as well have been nothing. And perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps the distinction between something and nothing was less clear than it seemed. Perhaps everything was always balanced on that edge, being and not being, existing and not existing, mattering and not mattering. The earth did not consider such things. It simply turned. The oceans did not wonder. They simply moved. The mountains did not question. They simply stood. And in standing, in moving, in turning, everything continued as it always had, as it always would. The darkness held them all, gently, the way darkness held everything, without effort, without intention, simply by being darkness, simply by being the space between light, the quiet between sound, the stillness between movement. And in that darkness, in that quiet, in that stillness, the earth slept, and the universe watched, patiently, without urgency, without need, just watching, just being, just continuing its slow, eternal, gentle existence.